There is a shot near the end of regular show, right before the credits roll on 8 seasons, where a small stone marker sits in the grass near the house, and it reads, simply, that a lollipop-shaped man chased butterflies. That is the epitaph the park gives to a being who was, by the show's own late-season mythology, one half of the most powerful force in the universe. Not a monument to power, a monument to the small, strange, tender thing he actually did with his life. Tonight we are going through every death in regular show, the real ones, the faked ones, the ones the show treats as a punchline, and the ones it treats as a wound that never fully closes. Some of what follows is documented plainly on the wiki and in the credits. Some of it is only ever implied, sketched in a flashback or a joke that got quieter the longer you sat with it. And where that is true, I will say so clearly, because a show this strange deserves to be walked through honestly rather than confidently. I am Velvo, and this video, like all the others, is here to help you fall asleep. So get comfortable, dim the lights, settle into whatever position your body has already decided it wants tonight. And let's start where the show itself starts most of its own reckonings with death, quietly, almost by accident, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon this whole series was built to feel like from its very first frame. Regular show, on the surface, is a workplace comedy. Two groundskeepers, a blue jay and a raccoon, avoid work at a park run by a gumball machine, and their errands spiral into cosmic disaster roughly once a week. That premise, on paper, has no obvious relationship to death, and yet almost from its first season, the show reaches for death constantly, casually, the way another show might reach for a joke about traffic or a joke about rent. Characters die and come back. A main character is revealed partway through to already be dead and has been the entire time, and nobody at the park finds this strange enough to mention. Death himself, capital D, rides a motorcycle through the show's back half like a recurring coworker who happens to also end lives for a living. By the time the show ends, it has killed off, resurrected, mourned, joked about, and finally sat with the weight of more deaths than almost any other animated comedy of its era attempted, and it did most of that without ever losing the soft, unhurried, half-asleep tone that made it feel like the kind of show you could have on in the background while you did nothing in particular on a Tuesday night. That tension, a show built for comfort that keeps circling back to endings, is where we're going to live for the next several hours. We'll move roughly in the order the show itself built its relationship with death, starting with the earliest, smallest, most throwaway uses of it in the first 2 seasons, working through the recurring cast of death, adjacent side characters, the show built up over its middle years, and ending with the 2 deaths that actually mattered by the finale's own accounting. The death that gets treated as a joke almost every time it happens, and the death that the show finally, after 8 seasons of avoiding it, decided to treat as real. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning tells you something the later seasons sometimes obscure. In its earliest run, regular show does not treat death as a big emotional event. It treats death as a mechanic. A character can die, and the show's response is usually a shrug, sometimes a laugh, occasionally a brief scene of someone getting escorted somewhere unpleasant before being brought back within the same 11 minutes. The show's first real personification of that mechanic is Death himself, who debuts in the second season in the episode Over the Top, and who the show designs verifiably as a British biker. He wears a black motorcycle jacket, a gray sleeveless shirt that does nothing to hide a visible ribcage, jeans held up with a belt buckled in the shape of a skull, and pointed leather shoes. His face is a greenish-white expanse of skin flaps that fold in such a way as to suggest, without quite committing to, a mustache and sideburns. He speaks in a thick Cockney accent, voiced by the actor Julian Holloway. He has one arm that is unremarkable, and one arm that is, for reasons the show never bothers to explain, and never really needs to, enormous and disproportionately muscular. He is, by the Wiki's own documentation, cruel in his early appearances. He enjoys collecting souls. He takes pleasure in the suffering of others. And in one of his first real showcases, he laughs while Skips struggles for his life, arm wrestling him for the fate of someone's soul. This is Death as obstacle, Death as villain of the week. Death is the kind of cosmic force the show can throw at its characters and then defeat through a game, because if there's one rule regular show returns to more than almost any other, it's that its universe runs on contests. You don't escape death in this world by being brave or being good. You escape it by winning. That detail is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something true about how casually the show initially wanted you to hold the concept. In Skips Strikes, Death arm wrestles Skips himself and loses, and from that loss, something interesting happens. Death becomes, gradually and without much fanfare, less of a villain and more of a fixture. He starts showing up not to end things, but to participate in the community around the park the way that any other recurring background character might. This shift matters because it previews something the show will do again and again with every death it stages. Introduce the concept as a threat, defeat the threat through a contest or a trick, and then quietly absorb whatever character embodied that threat into the found family of the park. Death doesn't stay an enemy. He becomes, in a strange and mostly unspoken way, one of the guys. By the time we get to Dead at 8 in the show's third season, Death has been given a wife and a son, Thomas, and the episode's plot, Mordecai and Rigby, babysitting Death's demon toddler, son, in exchange for sparing Muscle Man's life after a near-fatal water slide stunt. Treats him with a warmth that would have felt impossible in his first appearance. He's still sarcastic. He's still, per the wiki, capable of real menace when provoked, furious at the state of his trashed house and his ruined harp. But underneath that, he is a father who loves his son, a husband anticipating an anniversary dinner with his wife, someone the show is quietly building out as a fully domesticated cosmic entity. This detail, that the personification of endings has a family, has an anniversary, has a home he once kept tidy, is not speculation. It is stated plainly across the show's supporting material. What is worth noting, and this part is closer to interpretation, is what that choice implies about the show's whole relationship to mortality. If Death himself is not exempt from ordinary domestic tenderness, then death in this universe is not the opposite of an ordinary life. It sits right alongside it, occasionally inconvenienced by traffic, occasionally invited to birthday parties, occasionally arm wrestling a Yeti for sport. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and there's no wrong answer to this. It's just nice to know who's out there in the dark with me tonight. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I like knowing there are people scattered across a dozen time zones, half asleep, letting the park hold them for a while. Okay, let's keep going. The recurring nature of death as a character sets up something the show leans on constantly in its middle seasons. The idea that death, in the world of regular show, is negotiable. This is not a metaphor I'm imposing on the material from the outside. The show structures its plots this way, episode after episode. If a character is about to die, the solution is almost never grief. The solution is a bet, a race, a trick, a contest, a loophole. In Dead at 8, the exchange is literal, a completed babysitting job for a spared soul. In other episodes across the run, characters win poker games against supernatural forces, out-eat a curse, out-drink a demon, best a villain at a video game, all to reverse something that in almost any other show would be final. The wiki documents dozens of these plots individually, monster of the week structures, where the stakes are framed as life or death, and the resolution is always some kind of contest rather than some kind of mourning. What this produces over 8 seasons is a strange emotional environment where the audience is trained not to fully trust any death the show shows you. And this training turns out to matter enormously by the time we reach the finale, because the show is fully aware of what it built. There's a moment, documented in coverage of a regular epic final battle, where an article discussing the ending explicitly notes that in a show where death itself is a recurring character, it can be genuinely difficult to know whether anyone is truly gone. That's not fan speculation. That's a stated observation about how the show's own mechanics complicate its emotional stakes. The show spent years teaching you that death was a puzzle to be solved rather than an ending to be sat with. And then, in its last 3 episodes, it had to find a way to make one Deathland as real, despite everything it had trained you to expect. There's a smaller detail worth pausing on before we move forward, because it clarifies something about how deliberately the show built Death's household. His wife, per the wiki, first appears in Dead at 8, getting ready, putting on earrings, for what the episode establishes as their wedding anniversary, the show taking care, even in an episode ostensibly about babysitting a demon toddler for the price of a friend's soul, to remind you that this is a marriage with its own small rituals, its own version of a night out. She's the one who, in that same episode, tells Mordecai and Rigby directly that she'll be disappointed in all 3 of them, her husband included, if the babysitting job goes wrong, which tells you plainly that in this household, accountability runs in both directions. Death isn't simply the boss of his own family, the way Benson is the boss of the park. He answers to someone too. That detail, small as it is, keeps the show's most cosmic character tethered to the same ordinary domestic gravity. Everyone else in this cast eventually has to find their way toward, And it's part of why, when we get to the finale and see Death fighting alongside the very people whose lives he's spent the whole series threatening to end, it never feels like a contradiction. He was always going to be there. He'd been quietly becoming one of them since the moment Skips beat him at arm wrestling, and the show decided, almost as an afterthought, that the personification of every ending in this universe deserved a home to go back to when his shift was over. Let's talk about the near deaths first, because there are more of them than people usually remember, and they matter because they're the show rehearsing over and over for the one death it eventually needed you to actually believe. The end of Muscle Man from the show's sixth season is maybe the cleanest example of this rehearsal structure. The premise, as documented, is straightforward. Muscle Man convinces the entire park that he's dying, that his declining health means his time is almost up, and he asks the gang to help him complete a bucket list before the end. It is, by design, a fake out. There's no real medical crisis. What's actually going on in the episode's quieter reveal is that Muscle Man wants to symbolically kill off his own performative persona, the loud, crass, my mom joke-telling Muscle Man, because he's engaged to Starla and believes in his own clumsy way that leaving that persona behind before the wedding is the mature thing to do. It's a fake death used to stage a real, if smaller, transformation. And it's worth noting, because it recontextualizes something we'll get to later, that this episode is explicitly called out by fans and by critical coverage as one of several moments that bear some similarities to the series finale. Rigby, in a completely different episode, at one point punches Pops into the sun during a death punch rampage, a small, almost throwaway beat that, watched after you know how the show ends, plays like an accidental piece of foreshadowing. Nobody could have fully intended, since the actual finale ends with Pops flying into the sun on purpose for entirely different reasons with an entirely different weight. These moments of rehearsal are everywhere once you start looking for them, and I want to be careful here to mark the difference between what's confirmed and what's a pattern I'm noticing, rather than something the show explicitly announces. It is confirmed, documented fact that the end of Muscle Man is a fake death used for personal growth. It is confirmed that Rigby punches Pops into the sun in an earlier, unrelated gag. What is interpretation, clearly labeled as such, is the idea that the show was, across its run, quietly training its own visual and emotional grammar around solar destruction and sacrificial framing, so that when the actual finale needed the audience to read flying into the sun as something enormous and final, the image already had a strange, half-buried familiarity. The show may simply have liked the image. Writers reach for striking visuals more than once without it being a grand plan. But the accumulation is there if you want to see it, and it's part of why the ending, when it finally arrives, feels less like a bolt from nowhere and more like something the show had been quietly gesturing toward the whole time. Now let's talk about the death that the show treats with the most sustained, genuine seriousness before the finale ever happens: the death of Muscle Man's father. In the third season episode, Trash Boat, an episode whose main plot is actually about Rigby legally changing his name to something humiliating, which tells you something about how the show likes to bury its heaviest material inside its silliest framing. There's a secondary storyline in which Muscle Man receives news that his father, Muscle Dad, has died. The documented cause of death, per coverage of the episode, is a horrible bear mauling. Benson asks Mordecai and Rigby to accompany Muscle Man on a road trip to the Trucker Hall of Fame, where Muscle Man intends to spread his father's ashes, specifically the ashes of his father's hat, a hat that reads "World's Greatest Trucker" at the highest point in the building, because that hat was the emblem of the identity Muscle Man had built his entire understanding of his father around. And then the show does something quietly devastating with the plot, something that recontextualizes the entire trip. At a truck stop along the way, 3 actual truckers tell Mordecai and Rigby that Muscle Man's father wasn't a trucker at all. He was a forklift driver. The mythology Muscle Man had constructed, the legendary larger-than-life trucker father, Muscle Dad, beloved and celebrated on the open road, was, at least in the specific details, not entirely true. Muscle Man had, knowingly or not, mythologized his father into something bigger than the actual facts of the man's working life. This is documented plot, not interpretation. What is interpretation, and what fans have built entire readings around, is what that gap between myth and reality is actually doing thematically. Because Muscle Man, across the whole series, is a character defined by exactly this kind of gap, a small, round, green man who insists he is muscular, who performs toughness while crying easily and loving deeply, who frames his entire personality around a father the show quietly reveals was gentler and smaller in real life than the legend Muscle Man carries around. The death of Muscle Dad in Trash Boat is the first time the show lets us see where that performance habit actually comes from. He learned to inflate the people he loves into something bigger than they were, because that's easier, sometimes, than sitting with the ordinary size of real grief. Mordecai and Rigby, to their credit, decide not to tell Muscle Man the truth about the forklift. They let him have the myth, and whether you read that as a kindness or as the show quietly endorsing a certain kind of comfortable dishonesty is genuinely up for interpretation. I don't think the show tells you which one it thinks it is. It just shows you 2 friends deciding, in the moment, that some truths aren't worth handing to a grieving person at the top of a memorial hall, holding an urn full of hat ashes, about to do the only ritual he has left to offer his father. This episode matters for another reason, too, one that's easy to miss on a first watch. It's one of the only times in the show's early to middle run that a death is treated as fully, unambiguously real, with no contest to win, no trick to reverse it, no loophole. Muscle Dad doesn't come back. There's no arm wrestling match against death to undo it. The show simply lets it have happened, and lets Muscle Man carry it, hat ashes and all, for the rest of the series, his eventual maturity, his eventual wedding to Starla, his eventual willingness in the end of Muscle Man to kill off his own performative persona. All of it sits downstream of this one quiet, early loss that the show never revisited, with the same intensity again, but never fully let go of either. Let's sit for a while with a death that the show never actually resolves, because it's one of the strangest and most persistently unanswered questions in the entire series. How did High Five Ghost die? Here's what's actually documented, and I want to be precise about this because the ambiguity itself is the real story. High Five Ghost, known to his friends as Fives, HFG, or High Fives, is, per the show's own character design and dialogue, unambiguously a ghost. High is small, mostly white and see-through, Pac-Man shaped, with 4 arms tucked invisibly into his body and one arm extending from the top of his head, permanently poised for a high five that, per the show's running gag, almost never gets returned. He has a brother, Low Five Ghost, who works as a police officer and who is also, per the show's internal logic, a ghost. Hung has, in certain flashback material, been shown as a ghost as a baby, which would suggest he was simply born that way rather than dying at some point in an ordinary life. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely confuses even careful viewers, he has also been shown at points to have had human-presenting parents, and the show, in at least one documented instance, depicts him turning into a physical skeleton upon dying within an episode's plot, only to be fine again shortly after, the way most temporary deaths in this show resolve. Critical coverage discussing this directly notes that High Five Ghost being uncomfortable whenever the subject of death comes up implies that he did in fact die at some point. The show never confirms when, how, or under what circumstances, and this is explicitly flagged, including by outlets covering the possibility of a reboot addressing it as one of the show's biggest unresolved mysteries. I want to be very clear here about where the line is between fact and reading, because this is exactly the kind of gap where a conspiracy-brained rewatch can run away from the actual text. What's confirmed? He's a ghost. He's uncomfortable discussing death, demonstrated specifically in Trucker Hall of Fame and at the end of Muscle Man. He has a brother who's also a ghost. The show never states when or how he died, and multiple pieces of supplementary material at different points gesture toward contradictory origins. Born a ghost versus died and became one. What's speculation, and what I'll frame as speculation, because that's the honest way to hold it, is the reading some fans have built that his discomfort is itself a kind of evidence, that somewhere underneath the show's structural refusal to explain him is an implication that his death was bad enough, sudden enough, or unresolved enough that he genuinely doesn't want to revisit it. And the show, in its own quiet way, respects that boundary by never forcing the reveal. What I find genuinely moving about this, treating it honestly as unresolved rather than pretending the show secretly explains it somewhere, if you look hard enough, is what the unresolved nature does to how we read his ending. Because Fives gets one of the gentlest outcomes of the entire main cast. He gets a relationship. He gets, per the finale's structure, a marriage and a small house, and implicitly, a family life. And the show never treats any of that as strange or exceptional for a ghost to have. Nobody in the park questions how a dead man builds a life like that. He just gets to have it, quietly, the same way Margaret gets her career and Rigby gets his degree. The mystery of his death stays a mystery. The ordinariness of his life afterward gets to be completely unremarkable, And there's something almost radical, if understated, in a show choosing never to explain the tragedy so that it can instead spend its energy showing you the life that came after, the version of afterlife that isn't haunted, isn't unfinished, isn't defined by whatever ended it. We should talk now about Skips, because Skips is where the show does its most explicit, most emotionally direct work, connecting death to who a character actually is. Unlike High Five Ghost, Skips' relationship with mortality is not a mystery the show refuses to solve. It's a wound the show shows you in full in a single dedicated episode and then lets echo through everything that follows. The episode is Skip's Story, airing in the show's 5th season, and it is, per the wiki, the moment where Skips finally tells Mordecai and Rigby how he became immortal. The story it tells is this: Skips, whose real name is Walks, was once an ordinary young man attending Bennett High School sometime in the era the show places at roughly 1814. I was a slacker, uninterested in school, until a group calling itself the Immortal Student Council, who would later become the guardians of eternal youth, introduced him to a girl named Mona, or Desdemona in full. At lunch, with nowhere else to sit, Mona invited him over, and the two of them began, per the episode's own structure, a slow, ordinary teenage courtship, sitting together, talking, working on prom decorations with an underwater theme, going on dates, and, this detail is worth pulling out specifically, skipping places together instead of walking. Walks, per the episode, learned to be handy with tools from her. He learned, in the show's own gentle phrasing, how to become handy with tools, and their bond, the wiki notes plainly, grew into mutual romantic attraction. There was, however, a bully at the school, Clorgbane, sometimes called Clorgbane the Destroyer, who had already established dominance over the school and who confronted Walks early in the episode. Walks, ready to fight, was stopped by Mona, who told him plainly that she didn't like guys who fought, and Walks, in response, promised her he would never fight again. He kept that promise for a while, but Clorgbane's bullying didn't stop, and the Guardians eventually offered Walks a way to actually defeat Clorgbane for good, an artifact called the Fists of Justice, gauntlets powerful enough to hurt a being no mortal could otherwise touch. Walks was tempted, and the timing of the eventual confrontation landed, of all places, at the prom, the one occasion, the show tells us, that Clorgbane would even accept as a battleground. Here is the moment that defines the rest of Skip's existence, and I want to walk through it exactly as documented, because the plainness of it is what makes it devastating. During the fight, a chunk of the ceiling collapses. It falls on Mona. She is killed instantly, in the middle of a confrontation Walks had promised her he would never be part of. Walks, in his grief and fury, receives the Fists of Justice and uses them to defeat Clorgbane, sending him not to death, but into orbit around the solar system, a fight from which Clorgbane would return roughly every 157 years, per the mythology the Guardians later establish, meaning Walks's war with him was never actually finished, only paused. And in the aftermath, the Guardians grant Walks immortality, not as a gift exactly, as a consequence. And this is the detail that turns the entire episode into something the show never really lets go of afterward. After losing Mona, walking itself became unbearable to him because walking was what he had been doing on the day he met her and what he'd been doing every day of the relationship they built together. So he started skipping instead. Every single footfall Skips takes for the rest of his, by that point, centuries long, existence is, by the show's own explicit framing, an act of refusal. He will not walk again, because walking is the thing he associates with a version of his life where Mona was still in it, and skipping is different enough, foreign enough, that it doesn't reopen the wound the same way. This is not fan speculation dressed up as fact. This is the literal, stated reasoning the episode gives for why an immortal Yeti moves through the world, the specific, ridiculous, slightly sad way he does, a joke the show had been telling since its first season, recontextualized in a single 20-minute flashback into one of the most quietly tragic pieces of backstory any character on the show receives. What is speculation? And I want to flag this clearly because it's a genuinely lovely reading that the show never confirms outright, is the broader fan theory that Skip's attachment to motorcycles later in the series, the way the show stages him with two-wheeled vehicles with a kind of reverence it doesn't extend to other objects, is a continuation of the same coping mechanism. That motorcycles, like skipping, represent a mode of movement, different enough from walking that they don't summon the memory, and that the specific motorcycle he rides most often might, in some unconfirmed emotional sense, be connected to Mona's memory in a way the show never states directly. There's no scene that confirms this. It's an extension of the established pattern, not documented text. But it's the kind of extension that holds together because the show has already told you, in plain language, that Skips organizes his entire relationship to motion around avoiding one specific grief, and it would be strange if that organizing principle simply stopped mattering the moment the flashback episode ended. What's confirmed, and what I think is the single most quietly remarkable thing about how the show treats Skips afterward, is that he never gets another romantic relationship for the rest of the series. Across all 8 seasons, through weddings and funerals and near apocalypses, Skips remains alone in that specific way, and the show never frames it as a problem to be solved, never sets him up on a date, never gives him a subplot about moving on. He is simply, permanently, the character for whom this particular grief did not get resolved by the finale the way almost everyone else's did. By the show's own distant future coda, when we see the entire cast settled into adult lives with partners and children, Skips is the one person still standing outside that structure, not punished for it, not pitied for it especially, just quietly, permanently altered by a ceiling collapsing on a prom night roughly 2 centuries earlier. Let's shift now toward the show's relationship with death as ritual and as a specifically male way of failing to process loss, because there's a pattern here worth naming plainly before we get to the finale itself. Nearly every major emotional death or near death in regular shows' run belongs to a male character, and nearly every one of those deaths gets processed, at least initially, through some form of avoidance, performance, or displacement rather than direct grief. Muscle Man mythologizes his father into a trucker legend rather than sit with the plainer, sadder truth of a forklift driver who died in a bear attack. Skips refuses to walk rather than confront what walking would make him remember. Rigby, in a completely different register, spends years avoiding finishing high school, not death adjacent in the literal sense, but structurally similar in that it's an unfinished piece of his own life he keeps circling rather than closing, until the show finally makes him sit down and complete it in its later seasons. Even Mordecai's arc, which isn't about death directly, follows the same shape. Years of indecision between Margaret and CJ that the show frames, per its own recurring structural choices, as cosmic scale problems, monsters and portals standing in for a young man who cannot bring himself to say a true thing to another person. This is where I want to be careful about the line between documented pattern and interpretive thesis. It is documented, plainly, across multiple individual episodes that Muscle Man mythologizes his father, that Skips refuses to walk, that Rigby avoids his diploma for years. What's interpretation is the broader claim, one I think the show earns, but which it never states in so many words, that regular show is, underneath its premise, a long meditation on how young men in particular avoid direct emotional confrontation with loss, and that nearly every one of its supernatural threats functions as a kind of pressure valve for feelings its characters won't access any other way. The show doesn't announce this thesis. It just keeps building episodes shaped exactly like it, over and over, for 8 years, until the pattern is difficult to read any other way if you're watching closely. I want to push a little further into this pattern, because once you start tracking it across the specific deaths we've already covered tonight, it holds together with a consistency that feels less like coincidence and more like an instinct the writers kept returning to without necessarily naming it out loud. Every one of the men in this cast processes loss by displacement rather than by direct statement, and the specific shape of that displacement tells you something different about each of them. Muscle Man displaces his grief for his father into performance, into volume, into crassness, into the loud maintenance of an identity built explicitly to never look like it's hurting. Skips displaces his grief for Mona into motion itself, into the literal mechanics of how his body moves through space, refusing an entire category of physical action because the memory attached to it is unbearable, which means his grief isn't something he thinks about periodically, so much as something he is constantly, physically, enacting every single time he crosses a room. Rigby displaces an entirely different, non-death related failure, the unfinished diploma, into avoidance so total that it takes years and the direct intervention of people who love him to even name the problem plainly. And Benson, whom we've theorized throughout tonight as the character closest to sensing something wrong with the park without ever being able to articulate what, displaces his fear into anger, into competence, into cake shaped like a bloodied face instead of a hug. What's notable, and what I think deserves its own moment of attention rather than folding it entirely into the pattern above, is that the show does eventually give each of these men a version of the direct statement they'd spent years avoiding, but it makes them earn it slowly, and it never treats the eventual breakthrough as a single triumphant scene, so much as a long, unglamorous accumulation. Muscle Man's turn comes specifically in the end of Muscle Man, where the fake death premise exists explicitly to let him kill off the performative version of himself before his wedding, a documented textual choice, not a reading I'm imposing, since the episode's entire structure is built around him wanting to leave his loud persona behind, specifically because he's engaged to Starla and believes it's the mature thing to do. That's a man using the language of death, even a fake one, because it's the only vocabulary intense enough to let him make a change he doesn't otherwise have permission to make in his ordinary life. Rigby's turn comes even more gradually, across years of the show's runtime, culminating in him actually finishing high school in a storyline the show treats, per the broader critical consensus around the character's arc, as one of the quietest, least glamorous triumphs of the entire series. No monster, no cosmic stakes, just a grown man sitting in a classroom finishing something his younger self left undone. And Benson's turn is the subtlest of all, folded into small character beats across multiple seasons rather than one dedicated episode, the show letting his anger soften in increments rather than all at once, until by the finale's own distant epilogue, he's shown settled into a life with a wife, choosing, notably, to raise animals rather than children. A detail that reads, if you want to extend the pattern one step further, as clearly labeled interpretation, like a man who found a version of caretaking that let him practice tenderness without the specific vulnerability of parenthood, which fits a character who spent 8 years demonstrating that vulnerability was the one thing he could never quite let himself show directly. I think it's worth contrasting all of this against Death himself, capital D, because he functions, structurally, as the show's one clear counterexample to this entire pattern, and I don't think that's an accident. Every human or human adjacent male character in this cast processes grief and fear through some kind of displacement. Death, the literal, cosmic personification of endings, is the one figure in the entire series who is shown, plainly and without complication, expressing direct domestic affection. He loves his wife. He worries about his son. He gets frustrated by a bad night of babysitting and expresses that frustration immediately and directly rather than through some elaborate performance. There's something almost too neat about this, and I want to flag clearly that the too neat quality is my own reading rather than a stated authorial intent, but it's hard not to notice. The one character whose entire cosmic function is to end things is also the only one in the show who never seems confused about how to feel things plainly while they're still happening. Death doesn't need a fake terminal illness to give himself permission to be honest. He just is all the time, because nothing about his existence requires him to perform anything else. The show never draws this contrast explicitly. It just builds the two patterns side by side for years and lets you notice, if you're looking, that the entity whose job is endings turns out to be more emotionally available than almost anyone actually still alive. Now, finally, let's go to the death. The entire series was building toward, whether or not it always knew it, the death of Pops. Here is what's fully documented, verified across multiple sources, including the show's own wiki, critical coverage of the finale, and the Wikipedia synopsis of a regular epic final battle. In the show's seventh season, it's revealed that Pop's Maillard, sweet, gentle, lollipop-headed, seemingly the least consequential member of the entire main cast for 6 seasons, is not who he appears to be. He is not Mr. Maillard's biological son. He is, in his true form, a being named Megacranus, born on a planet called Lollyland, where his birth is what the natives call the perfect creation, the embodiment of pure good, automatically necessitated the creation of an opposite, a being of pure malevolence, to maintain cosmic balance. That opposite is Malum Cranus, whom Mordecai and Rigby nickname Anti-Pops. The first time they encounter him, Pops and Anti-Pops are, per the show's own established mythology, fated to battle for the fate of the universe, roughly every 14 billion years, and every single previous iteration of that fight has ended the same way. A stalemate, their perfectly balanced powers canceling out, the universe resetting and beginning again, over and over, an ancient cycle. Neither brother has ever actually broken. In the finale, Anti-Pops decides to break the pattern himself by attempting to erase Pops from existence before the fated confrontation can even happen, so he can finally destroy the universe outright rather than simply reset it. He very nearly succeeds. Documented plainly across recap coverage, in the finale's climactic battle, Anti-Pops erases almost the entire supporting cast of the show: Muscle Man, High Five Ghost, dozens of recurring characters built up across 8 years, all wiped from existence in front of Mordecai, Rigby, and Pops, who are the only ones spared because they're directly involved in the confrontation. This is real in the sense that the show does not undercut it with a joke in the moment. It stages an actual erasure of nearly everyone the audience has spent years getting to know, and it lets that erasure sit, terribly, for the length of the fight. Pops, aware, through flashbacks the show gives him mid-battle, that fighting Anti-Pops directly will only produce the same stalemate it always has, does something different. Rather than trying to defeat his brother through combat, he grabs him and flies toward the sun, and in that final stretch of flight, something the show frames very deliberately as reconciliation happens between them. Anti-Pops, per the documented plot, shows genuine remorse. The two brothers, per multiple sources describing the scene, are at peace with each other before they fly into the sun together. They both die. This is not a trick death, not a contest, not a loophole. Pops, by every documented account of the episode, is gone. And because the resetting cycle that had defined their entire cosmic relationship is broken by this specific choice, not defeating each other, but refusing to keep fighting at all, the effects of Anti-Pop's earlier erasure reverse. Muscle Man comes back. High Five Ghost comes back. Everyone Anti-Pops erased during the battle returns, restored, alive, while Pops and Anti-Pops themselves remain gone. The wiki is explicit about this trade. The sacrifice that ends the 14 billion year cycle is also the exact mechanism that resurrects everyone else who died getting there. Pops's death is not incidental to the happy ending. It is the ending's price. I want to sit with the specific texture of how the show stages this, because the details matter more than the summary. Before the fight, per critical coverage of the episode, the rest of the park crew, fully aware of what's coming and how frightened Pops is, try to distract him with small, absurd gestures of love. Mordecai and Rigby perform a rap for him. Benson bakes him a cake shaped, unsettlingly, like his own bloodied face, apparently intending it as some kind of dark joke or morale boost rather than a genuine threat. Muscle Man and Skips set off fireworks. Eventually, the gesture escalates into an actual party for someone who is, within hours, going to fight for the fate of existence. And the show frames this not as tonal whiplash, but as exactly the kind of thing this specific found family would do in the face of something this enormous. Throw a party, because that's the register they've spoken in for 8 years, and there's no reason cosmic stakes should force them into a different emotional language than the one that's always worked. The supporting cast, the guardians of eternal youth, Death himself, characters going all the way back to the show's earliest seasons, return for the fight, each one, per the recap, given a brief individual send off, a small moment of closure folded into an enormous battle. Eileen directs the entire operation from inside a giant mecha assembled from the combined supporting cast, which is, structurally, one of the strangest and most quietly beautiful choices the finale makes. The show's most emotionally honest, steadiest character literally piloting the machine made from everyone the park has ever loved. After Pops's death, the show gives itself one more structural choice worth noting precisely. The park erects a memorial statue. Its plaque, documented directly, reads that he chased butterflies. Not that he saved the universe, not that he died a god. That he chased butterflies, a detail pulled from small, throwaway character beats across the earlier seasons, the show choosing, in its very last gesture toward him, to memorialize the smallness rather than the cosmic scale. Mr. Maillard, the hard-nosed businessman who spent the entire series treating his staff as disposable while reserving an inexplicable tenderness for Pops alone, mourns him at that memorial. And this is where interpretation, clearly marked as such, becomes almost impossible to resist. The show never states outright that Mr. Maillard knew, from the beginning, exactly what Pops was and exactly what his fate would eventually require of him. But the accumulated pattern of his behavior across the whole series, his uncharacteristic gentleness toward one specific person in a life otherwise defined by harshness, his willingness to keep an entire operating park running as cover for decades, makes that reading very difficult not to reach for, even though the show itself leaves it as subtext rather than stated fact. The finale doesn't end on the death, though. It moves past it, deliberately, into what the wiki and multiple recaps describe as a distant epilogue, the park crew returning to Earth after 3 years away, followed by a jump forward across 25 years of their lives, ending at a reunion. Mordecai becomes a successful painter, marries a bat named Steph, a character the audience had genuinely never met before that moment, a detail that produced, per fan discussion documented across multiple sources, years of debate about why the show chose someone entirely new rather than resolving the long-running Margaret versus CJ question directly. Rigby, per the documented outcome, eventually finishes the high school diploma he'd been avoiding for years, marries Eileen, and by the reunion is shown with children. Muscle Man is shown discovering, upon returning from 3 years in space, that his wife gave birth to a daughter in his absence, and by the time of the reunion, he's a grandfather. Benson and his wife, notably, don't have children. They raise the animals instead, a small detail that fits his character without needing much elaboration. And Skips, per the documented ending, remains alone, the show explicitly noting that nobody, in his own accounting, can replace Desdemona. I want to close this particular thread, the thread of Pops specifically, by returning to something I mentioned near the start, because it's the detail that I think actually contains the show's whole argument about death, if it has one at all. For years, the show trained you not to trust its own deaths. It gave you contests to win, tricks to pull, arm wrestling matches against Death himself that could be won outright. And then, in its very last stretch of episodes, it needed you to believe, fully and without a loophole, that this specific ending was real, and it earned that belief not by making the death bigger or more spectacular than everything that came before, but by making the memorial smaller. A statue, a plaque about butterflies, a found family throwing a party for someone the night before he goes to die, because that's the only language of love they'd ever learned to speak fluently. The show spent 8 years teaching its audience that death could be negotiated, reversed, defeated in a game, and then it ended by showing you the one death in the whole series that nobody negotiated at all, and it made that restraint the most powerful thing it ever did. I want to go back into the finale itself for a moment, because I moved through it quickly the first time, and there are specific, documented details in how the show stages the night before Pops's death that deserve more room than I gave them, because they're where the show's whole emotional philosophy about mortality gets condensed into a handful of small gestures. Per the critical coverage of a regular epic final battle, the night before the confrontation, the entire park staff, fully aware of what's coming, does not sit Pops down for a solemn conversation about legacy or fear. They try instead a sequence of small, slightly absurd interventions, clearly meant to distract him, each one calibrated to whatever specific skill or personality quirk that character brings to the group. Mordecai and Rigby perform a rap for him, the show's oldest, most reliable register for two people who have never quite learned to say a serious thing directly, reaching for rhythm and joke structure instead of plain language, because that's the only vocabulary they've built for affection across 8 years of friendship. Benson, whose entire arc we discussed earlier as one of quiet, unacknowledged dread, the character theorized to be the only one sensing something is fundamentally wrong with the park's deeper nature, responds to the actual, literal knowledge that something is fundamentally wrong by baking Pops a cake shaped like his own bloodied face. It's a strange, dark, borderline inappropriate gesture, and the show doesn't explain it away or soften it. It just lets it exist, exactly as strange as it is, because Benson's love has never once, in the series run, come out looking like tenderness. It comes out looking like control, like competence, like doing something, anything, with his hands rather than sitting still with how frightened he actually is. Muscle Man and Skips set off fireworks, and eventually, per the documented structure, all of this small, scattered effort escalates into an actual party, one that, notably, ends up reminding Pops of the exact stakes everyone had been trying to distract him from, because the party brings together the full extended cast the show is built across its run: the Guardians of Eternal Youth, Death himself, HD DVD, and Blu ray, characters who'd mostly existed as one off gags in earlier seasons, now assembled in the same room as a reminder of exactly how much stands to be lost. The battle itself, when it comes, is staged with a level of scale the show had never previously attempted, and the documented recap of a regular epic final battle notes something specific worth dwelling on. Nearly the entire supporting cast returns for it, not just the main seven: Carter and Briggs, the Baby Ducks, Party Horse, Chance Sure Shot, Toothpick Sally, Recap Robot, characters going back to the show's earliest, silliest seasons, all called back for one last appearance, each one, per the same coverage, given a brief individual send-off folded directly into the larger fight. This detail matters because it's the clearest possible evidence that the show understood, by its own ending, exactly what it had built over 8 years. Not really a workplace comedy with occasional cosmic stakes, but an enormous, sprawling ensemble of relationships, most of them absurd, most of them introduced for a single joke and never meant to matter again, and the finale chooses, deliberately, to treat every single one of them as worth one more moment of screen time before the credits. And then there's Eileen. I mentioned this once already, but I want to give it its full weight here, because it's one of the strangest and most quietly moving structural choices in the entire finale. The combined supporting cast, in the climax of the battle, assembles into a single giant mecha, and Eileen, the character we discussed earlier as the show's model of unguarded emotional honesty, the one who never once across the whole series lied about how she felt, is the one piloting it. Not Mordecai, not Rigby, not Benson, for all his competence, or Skips, for all his centuries of experience. Eileen, quiet and patient and honest since the moment she was introduced as a background joke about a crush the show didn't initially take seriously, ends up literally at the controls of the combined weight of everyone the park has ever loved, directing that weight toward the fight that matters most. If you're inclined toward the reading we discussed earlier, that Eileen represents something the show holds up as the actual model for what emotional maturity looks like, this is about as direct an answer as the finale ever gives you. The most honest person in the cast gets to be the one steering everyone else's collected love into the moment it's needed. Muscle Man gets one more beat worth naming specifically, and it's documented plainly in coverage of the episode. During the fight, before things turn genuinely dark, he gets one last successful prank against Anti-Pops' forces, along with, per the reviewer's own description, a final, phenomenal my mom joke, a callback to arguably the single most repeated, most deliberately worn down running gag in the entire series, the joke about his mother that the show has been telling in slightly different shapes since its earliest seasons. that the writers chose to give him one more iteration of that specific joke in the middle of a battle where he is, within the same episode, actually erased from existence alongside High Five Ghost before Pops's sacrifice reverses it, tells you something plain about how the show wanted you to feel in that moment. Not that the joke had stopped mattering because the stakes had gotten serious, but that the joke and the stakes could sit in the same breath, because that's what this specific show had always done, all the way back to its first season, and it wasn't going to abandon that instinct in its very last episode just because the ending finally had teeth. There's a smaller death worth mentioning here, too, one that gets far less attention than Pops's, but that sits right alongside it in the finale's own structure, and that's Anti-Pops. It would be easy to treat him purely as a villain, whose death is simply a victory condition, the obstacle cleared, so the good guys can go home. But the documented text of the ending resists that reading. Anti-Pops shows remorse in his final moments. Per multiple sources describing what happens after the finale, Anti-Pops is shown residing afterward in an afterlife where his personality is noticeably more playful and friendly, and where his relationship with his brother, the brother he spent the entire final season trying to erase, is, in this afterlife setting, healthier than it had ever been while they were both alive. This detail moves the ending's emotional register somewhere unexpected. The fight was never really between good and evil, in the simple sense the show spent 7 seasons implying it would be. It was between two halves of a single cosmic balance who had never actually been given the chance, across 14 billion years of resets, to just stop fighting long enough to know each other. Death, in that reading, and I'll flag this plainly as interpretation because the show doesn't use this language itself, becomes the thing that finally makes room for the reconciliation the entire mythology had been structurally preventing. Not a punishment, not even really an ending, the first real conversation two brothers ever managed to have. Before we get there, though, I want to name plainly what all of this, Death's marriage, Mona's ceiling, the trucker hat full of ashes, the cart driving himself off a cliff on his own terms, actually adds up to when you hold it all at once, rather than one episode at a time, the way the show originally handed it to you across 8 scattered years. It adds up to a series that never had a single, tidy philosophy about endings, and was probably better for it. Some deaths in this show are jokes with no weight at all, gone by the next scene. Some are wounds that never close, carried for centuries by someone who never gets to fully explain why he moves the way he moves. Some are lies. A grieving son tells himself so gently that the show itself declines to correct him. And one, right at the very end, after years of teaching you not to trust any of it, turns out to be simply permanently real and asks you to sit with that the way none of the others ever did. Let's talk for a moment about the deaths the show plays purely for comedy, because it would be dishonest to spend this whole video treating every death in regular show with the same weight the show itself doesn't always give them. Across its run, the show kills off minor characters, background figures, one-off antagonists, and occasionally its own main cast in ways explicitly designed to be funny rather than moving. Characters get crushed, incinerated, vaporized and erased in background gags that exist purely for a laugh, and the show trusts its audience to know the difference, largely because it has, structurally, taught that difference through repetition. A death played for comedy tends to happen fast, with minimal buildup, often to a character we've just met or don't know well, and it's usually undone by the end of the same episode without comment. A death played for weight, muscle dads, Monas, eventually Popses, gets a slower build, a specific ritual attached to it, a detail that outlives the episode it happens in. The show is, in this specific sense, remarkably consistent about signaling which register it's operating in, even as it moves between the two constantly, sometimes within the same 11 minutes. The Halloween specials deserve mention here too, because they occupy a strange middle ground between comedy and something closer to actual horror. The wiki documents these specials as some of the only points in the series where characters die in ways the show treats with real, if temporary, gravity. The stakes feel more dangerous, the humor gets sharper and darker rather than lighter, and multiple recurring cast members meet ends within these specials that are structurally played straighter than almost anything else in the regular season. This is documented tonal fact, not interpretation. The Halloween episodes are consistently darker in how they handle death than the show's baseline. What's interpretation? And it's a reading I find genuinely compelling even though the show never states it, is that these specials function as a kind of annual release valve, a night where the show allows itself to be honest about how thin the boundary between ordinary park life and genuine mortality actually is, before returning the next episode to pretending that boundary doesn't exist at all. I want to spend some time now on a detail that connects several of these threads together, and it's the show's voice cast, because it turns out to carry more thematic weight than a casual viewer would expect. As I mentioned earlier, and want to restate clearly here, because it's frequently misreported, Sam Marin voices exactly 3 of the show's characters: Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, not 4. This gets confused sometimes, because Marin voices a large number of additional background and minor characters across the run: Garrett Bobby Ferguson, the Sensei, various one-off roles. But among the show's core main cast, his performances are specifically Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man. High Five Ghost is voiced separately, primarily by J.G. Quintel, who also voices Mordecai. Skips is voiced, across the entire run, by Mark Hamill, a piece of casting fans return to constantly, specifically because of how unrecognizable the performance is next to his more famous roles: a gravel-voiced, patient, ancient Yeti who sounds nothing like either the Joker or Luke Skywalker. The reason this matters for a video about death specifically is the thematic pattern fans have noticed in Marin's specific trio. Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man are, across the show's run, 3 of its most emotionally volatile characters. Benson's simmering, barely contained fury, Pops's practiced, gentle avoidance of anything difficult, Muscle Man's loud, performative toughness, masking real tenderness. All 3, notably, are characters whose big emotional breakthroughs involve death directly. Benson eventually softening, Pops's entire arc culminating in his own, Muscle Man's arc built almost entirely around processing his father's. This is, I want to be honest, interpretation rather than confirmed authorial intent. There's no interview I found stating that the writers deliberately clustered these three specific emotional arcs under one actor's voice as a thematic choice. It may simply be a practical casting decision that happened to land on three characters who, independently, ended up carrying some of the show's heaviest material. But the pattern, once you notice it, is difficult to unsee. For 8 years, one human voice has been asked to carry the boss's rage, the son's gentle denial, and the friend's performed toughness, and all three of those registers turn out, by the finale, to be different ways of avoiding the same basic thing. Let's turn now to a death that the show handles with an almost eerie lightness relative to its actual content: the recurring destruction and near loss of the park itself, culminating in its literal removal from Earth during the space arc. This isn't a character death in the traditional sense, but the show, across its final seasons, treats the loss of the park with genuine grief, and it's worth naming that clearly. Documented across the wiki's coverage of the space arc, the park is physically wrenched off Earth and converted into a fugitive spacecraft, chased by Anti-Pops's forces, and the staff become reluctant intergalactic refugees for a period the show places at roughly 3 years. The wiki notes the eventual return of the park to Earth months after other displaced locations return, and roughly 3 years after the initial departure. This return is not framed, per the documented text, as a simple restoration. The park that comes back is not narratively treated as identical to the one that left. It has been through something. The show doesn't dwell on this at length. It's mostly implication built from tone rather than dialogue, but the choice to let the returning park feel altered rather than simply restored fits the show's broader pattern of refusing easy reversals for its biggest losses, even when, mechanically, the loss does eventually get undone. I want to return, before we close, to the smallest and most human of the show's mortality-adjacent stories, because I think it's easy to let the cosmic scale of pops and anti-pops crowd out something that actually matters just as much: the show's decision, across its final stretch, to give nearly every surviving character a specifically ordinary future. Documented plainly in the distant epilogue, nobody becomes famous, nobody achieves cosmic power or lasting glory. Mordecai paints, Rigby finishes school and starts a family, Muscle Man becomes a grandfather, Benson raises animals instead of children. This is, again, documented text rather than interpretation. The wiki and multiple recaps describe this future plainly. What's interpretation, and it's the reading I find most persuasive after everything we've walked through tonight, is that this ordinary future is the show's actual answer to the question every death in the series had been circling for 8 years. Not, how do you defeat death? Not even, how do you survive it? But, what do you do with the time you get afterward, once the contest is over and there's no more trick left to pull? You paint. You go back to finish the thing you'd been avoiding. You raise the family, or you raise the animals, or, if you're skips, you simply keep skipping, alone, for as long as it takes, because that's still, After everything, the only way you know how to carry what you lost. That is, in the end, the whole shape of how regular show handles death, not a single consistent philosophy, because the show is far too playful and far too willing to change registers scene to scene for that, but a genuine, if uneven, education in the difference between the deaths you can win a game to reverse and the ones you can't. It killed a father off screen and let his son mythologize him into something bigger and kinder than the facts supported. It gave an immortal groundskeeper a single, permanent grief that no amount of centuries or plot resolution ever asked him to get over. It left one of its own main character's deaths a total, deliberate mystery, and then let him have an ordinary, happy life anyway, refusing to make his afterlife contingent on the audience ever understanding how he got there. And at the very end, after years of teaching you that nothing in this universe had to stay lost, it let its gentlest character fly into the sun with the being who had spent his entire existence trying to kill him, and it let that be, finally, real, reconciliation, and ending arriving in the same instant, the same embrace doing the work of both a war's last battle and its first act of forgiveness. Before we close the door on the park tonight, I want to spend some real time somewhere I've only touched briefly so far, because it's actually one of the densest concentrations of death in the entire series, and it's a place the show built specifically so it could kill people without consequence. The Halloween specials, collectively known as Terror Tales of the Park. Here's the documented structure, because it matters for understanding why these episodes behave so differently from everything else we've discussed tonight. Starting in the show's third season and continuing through its eighth and final one, regular show produced 6 of these 30-minute Halloween anthologies, explicitly modeled per the creator's own acknowledged influence on Treehouse of Horror from The Simpsons. And crucially, per the wiki's own framing, these specials are not considered canon to the regular continuity of the show. That single production choice is what allows them to do something almost nothing else in the series can do: kill main characters permanently, repeatedly, gruesomely, without it affecting a single subsequent episode. The framing device is always the same: the park staff telling each other scary stories, usually while driving somewhere or waiting for something, and each story becomes its own contained nightmare, where the ordinary rules of the show's negotiable, reversible mortality simply don't apply, because none of it happened. Not really, not in the timeline that matters for next Tuesday's episode. The first one, simply titled Terror Tales of the Park, contains a segment called In the House, which is structurally a parody of the Evil Dead franchise, and it is, per multiple documented breakdowns of the episode, one of the most casually brutal 10 minutes the show ever produced. Muscle Man gets dragged away by a wizard antagonist and has his skin removed, living just long enough, per the recap, to flex his exposed muscles once before falling dead. High Five Ghost is sucked into a phone and ground into ectoplasm that sprays across the room. Benson is flushed into a toilet, which cracks his head open and causes him to spew gumballs everywhere. Skips, the immortal Yeti, who has survived literal centuries, gets sucked up a chimney and burned alive. Pops is knocked around a room and stuffed into a closet before simply vanishing into nothingness. Mordecai is decapitated, and, in a detail that's almost unbearably funny, given everything else happening in the frame, his severed head lives long enough to remark that so this is what it's like to be as tall as Rigby. And Rigby himself, who the framing device reveals, had actually been the literal house. The entire story took place inside, is finally crushed and drowned by a giant egg. Every single one of these deaths, per the documentation, is treated with a kind of gleeful, bloodless cruelty that the show never allows itself anywhere in its regular canon. It's noted that a good portion of this specific segment was censored for broadcast in some international markets, which tells you plainly how far outside the show's usual register this material sits. The second special, Terror Tales of the Park 2, follows a similar shape. One segment, Wallpaper Man, ends with the entire main group dying together when their tow truck crashes into a tree, a genuinely bleak, unresolved downer ending that the show, per the recap, plays completely straight, noting specifically that Benson seems to be the only one even upset about it within the story's own internal logic. Another segment, Party Bus, ends with several characters aging in reverse until they simply vanish. A third involves Mordecai accidentally killing his own uncle in a bowling alley and being haunted by the resulting guilt. None of these deaths carry forward. None of them need processing the way Muscle Dad's death does, or the way Mona's does. They exist in a sealed, self-contained space, the show built specifically so that once a year, for one night, it could show you exactly how casually and thoroughly its own cast could die, without any of it costing anything the next morning. By the third and fourth installments, the show leans even further into this. Terror Tales of the Park 3 contains a segment called Jacked Up Jack-O-Lantern that, per critical coverage, has almost no story to it beyond the pumpkin-themed deaths of High Five Ghost, Rigby, Mordecai, and Muscle Man in quick succession, death used not even as horror anymore, but as pure rapid-fire gag structure, one after another, with barely a pause for reaction. The fourth installment plays with the format itself, structuring one segment as a direct riff on The Sixth Sense, in which it's eventually revealed that Benson, not Mordecai and Rigby, was the one who died. A twist ending built entirely around audience expectation of who in this specific found family is allowed to be the ghost and who isn't. What I find genuinely worth sitting with here, treating this plainly as interpretation because the show never states it as intentional commentary, is the contrast these specials create against everything else we've spent tonight discussing. Every real death in regular show, Mona's, Muscle Dad's, eventually Pops's, earns its weight specifically because the show refuses, in those instances, to let itself off the hook with a reset or a trick. But the Halloween specials exist as a pressure valve for exactly the opposite impulse, a space where the show can indulge its most casual, disposable relationship with mortality without contaminating the emotional credibility it's carefully building everywhere else. It needed somewhere to put the version of itself that finds death funny, cheap, and instantly reversible, so that the rest of the series could hold on to the version of itself that occasionally, carefully, does not. There's another death worth walking through carefully because it's one of the show's clearest and most self aware jokes about exactly the kind of undoing we've spent this whole video tracking, and that's Garrett Bobby Ferguson. Garrett Bobby Ferguson, GBF2 Mordecai and Rigby, nicknamed Giant Bearded Face, debuts in the second season episode High Score as, per the wiki's own documentation, the reigning universe record holder for an in-universe arcade game called Broken Bones. He's designed as a floating human head with long brown hair and an enormous beard, capable of sprouting arms and legs directly out of his face when needed, and his entire character is a fairly direct parody of Billy Mitchell, the real-world competitive gamer whose claimed high scores in games like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man were later stripped after allegations of tampering. In High Score, GBF cheats to defend his title against Mordecai and Rigby, fabricating a sob story to manipulate the crowd, and when the two of them ultimately beat him anyway, through a combination of sabotage, biting his leg, and kicking him in the chin, because this is still, underneath everything, a show about slackers who solve problems by being annoying. The documented result is that Garrett Bobby Ferguson's head simply explodes. He dies, on screen, from the sheer indignity of losing a video game record. And then, because this is regular show, death for GBF turns out to be a temporary inconvenience rather than an ending. He returns years later in the fourth season premiere, Exit 9B, this time not as himself, but through his son, Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr., who, per the documented plot, seeks to avenge his father's death by attempting to open a literal gateway to the underworld through which he can revive every villain the park has ever defeated, his own father included. The episode's resolution involves Mordecai and Rigby collecting legal signatures to make the park an official historical landmark, which somehow, and there's no point pretending this makes conventional sense, because the show never asks you to take its own mechanics that literally causes the portal to suck all the revived villains back into the underworld, GBF Jr. included, ending in another explosion. Two generations of the same joke, structured almost identically. A father dies from losing at a game. A son dies trying to reverse that loss through cosmic means, and the show treats both deaths with the same cheerful, bloodless disregard it reserves specifically for characters who exist to be defeated rather than mourned. What's documented and worth stating plainly, Garrett Bobby Ferguson does eventually get one more brief return, appearing in a later episode as a witness testifying against Mordecai and Rigby in a court proceeding, revived apparently just long enough to participate in a joke about how thoroughly his death and its aftermath had entangled itself in their reputation. He also appears, at another point, memorialized as a bronze statue within an arcade game, a small, almost throwaway detail that nonetheless fits a pattern we've seen already tonight, of the show choosing to memorialize its dead through small physical objects rather than through direct emotional reckoning. Pops gets a plaque about butterflies. Muscle Dad gets ashes inside a trucker hat. Garrett Bobby Ferguson gets a bronze statue inside a video game cabinet, presiding forever over the exact medium that both made him and killed him. There's a version of this reading and I want to be careful to label it clearly as interpretation because the show never states it in these terms, where Garrett Bobby Ferguson functions as the show's most literal embodiment of an idea we discussed earlier: the danger of getting permanently stuck on the high score of your own youth. I is, structurally, exactly what Mordecai and Rigby could become if their own slacker tendencies calcified into something bitter and record obsessed, rather than something they eventually grow out of. He died once already from precisely that obsession, and his death didn't teach his son anything. It simply produced a second, smaller version of the same grievance, determined to reverse an ending that, by every rule the show usually follows, should have been reversible and instead just detonated a second time. There's one more death worth sitting with before we move toward the close, and it's the smallest, strangest, and in some ways most purely emotional one in the entire series, because it doesn't happen to a person at all. It happens to a golf cart. In the third season episode, Out of Commission, documented plainly across the wiki and multiple episode recaps, Benson informs Mordecai and Rigby that the park has extra money this year and that their old, battered golf cart, the one they've used constantly across the show's run, is going to be replaced with something newer, a vehicle the show calls the Smarten Carton. Mordecai and Rigby are told to take the old cart to the dump. Before they can, in a detail that's played for pure absurdist comedy, but which the show, characteristically, refuses to treat as only a joke, once it gets going, the cart is accidentally brought to life. The wiki specifies this happens when Mordecai and Rigby pour soda on its hood, jump-starting its motor into something like consciousness, and it immediately begs them for one more day alive before it's destroyed. What follows is, structurally, a hospice narrative wearing the skin of a regular show bit. The cart, now sentient and voiced, per the wiki, by a storyboard artist on the show, asks for small, specific things before he goes: a real car wash, rather than the improvised soap and hose treatment Mordecai and Rigby initially offer him; a last drive; a shot, according to the documented transcript, at something the episode frames as a kind of romantic encounter arranged by Mordecai and Rigby, connecting him via jump cables to a red Volkswagen Beetle they've decided is a lady cart, so that cart, capital C, because by this point in the episode, the show has given him enough interiority to earn the proper noun, can have one experience of intimacy before whatever happens next. Every one of these requests gets granted, a little reluctantly, because Mordecai and Rigby, per the documented dialogue, keep protesting that each last wish was supposed to be the actual last one, and Cart keeps promising, with the particular shamelessness of someone who knows he has leverage, that this next thing really will be the final ask. The episode ends, per the recap, with the group watching Cart drive himself off a cliff, his own choice, his own ending, staged with an unmistakable, almost ceremonial finality, only for Benson to reveal immediately afterward that he'd made an accounting error, that they can't actually afford to keep the new Smarten Carton after all, and that the seat warmer in the replacement vehicle had already caused third-degree burns to a significant portion of Muscle Man's body regardless. This is documented as what TV Tropes specifically labels a shaggy dog story, an entire emotional arc that mechanically changes nothing about the actual state of the park, since they needed to keep using an old cart anyway, except that the specific cart they'd bonded with across an entire episode is now genuinely, permanently gone. I want to be honest about what this episode is and isn't doing, because it would be easy to overread 11 minutes of golf cart comedy into something it doesn't fully earn. This is, first and plainly, a joke. The show finding an absurd container, literally a container with wheels, to stage its familiar rhythms of reluctant compliance and escalating requests, the kind of structure regular show uses constantly for its side character bits. But underneath the joke, and I'll flag this specifically as a reading rather than stated authorial intent, is something that quietly rhymes with everything else we've covered tonight. Cart, like Muscle Dad, like Mona, like Pops eventually, gets to choose the shape of his own ending rather than have it simply happen to him. He asks for cleanliness, for one good experience of connection, for a final act of motion under his own control, and the show grants every one of those requests before letting him go off a cliff on his own terms, in a moment staged with more visual grandeur than its silly premise would seem to demand. It is, genuinely, one of the only deaths in the entire series where the character being lost gets a full, uninterrupted 3 request bucket list, the exact structure the end of Muscle Man would later borrow seasons afterward for an actual main character facing an entirely fake medical crisis. The show, it turns out, workshopped its bucket list death structure on a sentient golf cart years before it had ever needed to use the same shape on someone it actually meant. There's one last thread I want to pull before we let the whole thing settle, and it's about the specific texture of time in this show, because death, in regular show, is almost never just about ending. It's about scale, about the enormous gap between how long some of these characters have already lived and how short the runtime of the show itself actually is. Skips, we've established, has been alive since roughly the early 1800s, which means that by the time Mordecai and Rigby ever meet him, he has already outlived Mona by nearly 2 full centuries. 200 years of skipping instead of walking. 200 years of watching ordinary mortal lives complete themselves around him. People he presumably worked alongside, people he presumably, in some incidental way, came to care about, all of them living out entire human lifespans and dying while he remained exactly the same, unaging, uninjured in any lasting way, immortal in the specific sense that the guardians of eternal youth extend to him. This is documented text, not speculation. His age is placed by the wiki at over 400 years old, and his origin story anchors the beginning of that span to a specific historical era. What's interpretation, though clearly the kind the show's own pacing seems to invite, is what that scale actually does to how we should read his stillness across the series. Every single main character we've discussed tonight gets an ending within the show's runtime. Mordecai gets Steph and a painting career. Rigby gets his diploma and a family. Muscle Man gets grandchildren. Benson gets his animals. Skips gets nothing that resembles closure, And I don't think that absence is a failure of the writing so much as the writing being honest about what 400 years of unresolved grief would actually look like. You don't heal from something like that within the time frame of a television show, however patient that show is willing to be. You just keep skipping. The show lets him keep skipping all the way to the reunion at the very end, all the way past the point where every other member of the cast has found some kind of settled peace, because it seems to understand, correctly I think, that some griefs simply outlast the narrative structures we build to contain them. There's a version of this same idea buried inside the Guardians of Eternal Youth themselves, and it's worth spending a moment here because it deepens the loneliness of Skips' situation rather than easing it. The Guardians, per the documented mythology, are the ones who granted Skips his immortality in the first place, in exchange for his willingness to fight Clorgbane, and they themselves are ancient, resembling infants, but speaking, per the wiki's own description, with mature, deep voices utterly mismatched to their appearance. They are Skips's peers, in the sense that they share his unnatural relationship to time, but they are not, by any account the show gives us, his friends in the way Mordecai and Rigby eventually become. They are the ones who administer his condition, requiring, per the established mythology, an annual ceremonial dance from him just to maintain the immortality they granted. A small, strange bureaucratic ritual sitting on top of an enormous personal tragedy, as if the cosmic order that gave him this unending life also, quietly, never let him forget that the life was granted rather than chosen. Even his immortality has a landlord. I keep coming back in all of this to the specific detail of the ceiling collapsing. Not Clorgbane's fists, not some grand cosmic battle wound, but a piece of architecture falling in the middle of an otherwise ordinary high school dance, killing a girl who had asked a lonely new student if he wanted somewhere to sit at lunch. There is nothing operatic about that death. It's the kind of death that happens in real, ordinary tragedies, sudden, structural, entirely disconnected from anyone's villainy or heroism, simply a ceiling in the wrong place at the wrong second. The show could have made Mona's death something Clorgbane did directly, a targeted cruelty with a clear line of cause and effect. It didn't. It let the actual killing blow be an accident, incidental to the fight rather than its point, and I think that choice, whether the writers fully intended its weight or not, is part of why the episode still lands as hard as it does decades into the show's afterlife in fan memory. Most grief doesn't come from villains. It comes from ceilings. I want to close out this stretch of the video by returning, one more time, to the idea we opened with and let it settle a little differently now that we've walked through so much of the material underneath it. Regular Show spent 8 years building an entire cosmology out of the idea that death could be beaten, argued with, tricked, negotiated, sealed off into a non-canon Halloween special where it wouldn't have to mean anything at all. And it used all of that structure, that entire elaborate architecture of reversibility, specifically so that when it finally needed one death to be real, needed you to sit in a memorial scene and actually believe the statue's plaque, actually believe that a plate of small good things named Mordecai and Rigby and Muscle Man and Skips would spend the rest of their lives without one particular lollipop-headed friend in them. The show had a whole language of undoing built up specifically to withhold. It never used the trick. It could have. It had 8 years of established precedent for pulling exactly that lever. It chose, instead, to let the one death that actually mattered stay a death. And I think that choice, more than any single image in the finale, is the real argument the show was making the entire time. It looked like it was just killing people for laughs. The jokes were never proof that nothing mattered. They were proof that the show knew exactly what it was withholding and exactly when. Eventually, it would finally let something cost what it actually cost. I want to note one final, small piece of documented detail before we let all of this settle, because it's easy to lose track of amid the cosmic scale of the finale, and it's actually one of the more human touches the show gives its own ending. Per the recap of a regular epic final battle, the returning cast for the last confrontation isn't limited to supernatural allies and cosmic institutions. Margaret is there. Mordecai's parents are there. Rigby's parents are there. Don, Rigby's brother, the one whose shadow shaped so much of Rigby's early Arrested development, is there too, alongside Starla and Pam and other figures from across the ordinary, non-cosmic side of these characters' lives. This detail matters because it quietly answers a question the show never states outright, but which hangs over the entire back half of its run. When the stakes finally become as large as they get, does the show pull its cast away from their ordinary human relationships and into a purely mythological register, or does it insist on keeping the ordinary people in the frame too? It chooses the second option. Margaret, who by this point in the timeline has already left the park to pursue her own career, still shows up for the fight. Rigby's parents, introduced across the series specifically as a loving, stable, unremarkable family. The show's quiet argument, as we discussed earlier, that Rigby's Arrested development was never about trauma he needed to overcome, are present at the exact moment their son's chosen family faces its largest possible threat. The cosmic and the domestic sit in the same frame right up until the end, because that's the balance the show insisted on holding for its entire run, and it wasn't going to abandon that instinct in its very last episode either. And maybe that's the whole thing, in the end, distilled down past the mythology and the wiki entries and the careful accounting of which death was real and which one was only ever a bit. A show that understood, better than most things made for children ever bother to, that the two categories aren't actually opposites. The joke and the grief live in the same house. Muscle Man can lose his father to a bear mauling and still, years later, get one more my mom joke in before the universe nearly ends around him. Skips can carry 2 centuries of unhealed loss and still be the one who shows up every single time with the exact fix a broken printer or a busted diary golem requires, because competence and grief were never actually in competition inside him. The show let its characters be funny and be devastated in the same breath, over and over, until by the time it needed you to sit with something real, it had already taught you, gently, without ever announcing the lesson, that neither one cancels the other out. Picture it the way the show itself liked to end its quietest episodes, with the light going soft and gold over the grass. The cart, a newer one now, since the old one drove himself off a cliff on his own terms years ago, parked crooked near the house the way it always was. Somewhere in that house, a blue jay who eventually stopped being afraid to choose is asleep beside someone he didn't meet until after the two people he spent a decade agonizing over had quietly stopped being the whole story of his heart. Somewhere nearby, a raccoon who took entirely too long to walk back into a classroom is now the kind of father who shows up on time, mostly because Eileen, who never once lied about how she felt in 8 years, made it impossible for him to keep lying to himself. Somewhere in a trailer or a house with a nursery in it, a green man everyone underestimated for years is holding a photograph of a father he never quite let himself see clearly, and telling that same story a little more honestly now than he used to, the trucker legend softening, just slightly, into something closer to the truth, because grief eventually does that if you let it sit long enough. And somewhere, still, on a road nobody else can quite place, an immortal groundskeeper skips rather than walks, the way he skipped for longer than the park has existed, the way he'll probably keep skipping long after every single one of his friends is gone, because some kinds of love don't get resolved by a finale. They just get carried indefinitely by someone strong enough and lonely enough to do it without complaint, one skip at a time, forever, or at least for as long as forever turns out to actually be. And somewhere above all of it, past the atmosphere, past the point where any of this show's usual rules about reversibility still apply, a memory of an embrace between two brothers is still expanding outward through the quiet dark of the universe. They broke the cycle to save, and the universe, having been given back everyone, Antipops erased in exchange for the two lives that ended the fight for good, holds that memory the way you'd hold something. You know, cost exactly what it looks like it cost. Not cheaply won, not undone by some clever trick in the show's back pocket, the way 7 prior seasons might have led you to expect. Just held, carefully, the way the truest things in this show were always eventually held once it finally decided to stop protecting itself from them. That's the whole architecture of it, walked from the surface all the way down to the bottom. A show that let almost everything be reversible for years, so that when it finally chose not to reverse something, you'd know, in your chest, exactly what that choice meant. It is a strange, gentle, occasionally very silly thing to build an entire emotional education around a blue jay, a raccoon, a gumball machine, a yeti, a green man, a ghost, and a lollipop-headed alien prince in disguise. But that's what happened here across 8 years and 244 episodes. And if you've spent tonight walking through all of it with me, in the dark, half listening, half drifting, then you've done exactly what this show always seemed to want from the people who loved it. You let it hold you for a while, deaths and jokes and all, without asking you to sort out in advance which parts were which. If you enjoyed spending this stretch of the night in the park, make sure you're subscribed because there's a lot more of it left to walk through together, and I'd genuinely like to have you back here with me next time, whenever that ends up being for you. Take care of yourselves out there, wherever you are, whatever time it is when this finally catches up to you, Let the last of it go now. Sleep well.